Welcome back, everybody. We're in week 10 already. And last week we talked about video surveillance systems, and this week we're going to talk about more of the same. But this week we're going to concentrate a little less on how they work and a little more on how you apply them. And we'll talk about different things like lighting and power and camera mounts. We'll do a lot on camera mounts because I think they're actually an overlooked thing, and if you understand them, your video surveillance program will be much better. But let's recap what we went over last week real quick and then get started. So we learned the difference between CCTV and a VSS. CCTV, closed circuit television, meaning just that, it's closed, it's not networked. I know that I was looking over the pictures that you posted of cameras in the community and at your homes and other places, and one student had a picture of the Blink camera at his home. That is definitely a VSS because he said I can view it remotely. If it was a CCTV, then he would need to have a set of wires, or even wireless, really, I guess you could, back to a receiver, but it wouldn't be viewable anyplace else other than on that system. We looked at the evolution of cameras, and we saw some big, boxy, old cameras that actually had film, all the way to the new modern with, that looked more like a spaceship than a camera. And we talked about some of the basic layouts of systems over time, from the days of, in-camera film through the VCR, the DVR, the NVRs, and now clouds, and a combination of NVR and clouds today. We talked about the importance of task and purpose, right? Think of task and purpose. My task today is to go to the bank to get a check for the rent. The purpose is to pay the rent so I don't have to live in the street, right? Think of it in those terms, difference between task and purpose. I won't get too deep into that because I think you understand it, but if you have trouble distinguishing between the two, try to put it in the context of things you do in your everyday life rather than cameras and card readers and those things. I'm taking a chainsaw to cut down a tree. That's my task. The purpose is that the tree is in the way of my view of the street, and I want to be able to see the street. So just put it into normal context if you're having trouble with that. We talked about some decision points for PTZ versus fixed cameras. PTZs sound really cool, and they are really cool. And in their, in the right application, they're fantastic. But a fixed camera will always be where you need it to be when you need to review footage or when you need to watch something. So always apply that logic. If I absolutely need to see this thing all the time, then it's a fixed camera, it's not a PTZ. You can always go with multiple lenses inside of the same housing as well, and you'd have a fixed camera that pointed 3 or 4 different ways. You'd have 3 or 4 fixed cameras inside of a single dome. We talked a little bit about the impact of lighting and weather and other factors, but we're going to go into that a little more. And so we're really going to start putting these cameras and devices into use. I will not tell you exactly where you should use what type of camera. I'll give you some general knowledge, but it really is very environmentally and very case specific. You need to understand what the cameras can do and what the different mounts do and what the different lighting does to make your own decisions on this. So really picking the right camera for the right application, in my opinion, has to do first with task and purpose, which it always should, right? If you don't know what you're going to do with the camera, why are you putting it up there in the first place? The environment, right? The right camera for the right environment. You would not put a purely indoor camera on the outside of a high-rise building hanging off the side of the building. It would last about 1 rainstorm. The power source, you have to understand how you're going to power that camera, and that can become a little bit tricky in modern buildings. You want to make a decision how you're going to power your camera. You want to decide whether it's going to be wired or wireless. Wireless cameras really have not taken off as much as one might think. Despite the home market, in the industrial market, they really haven't taken off as much. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that you normally need a booster of some kind. There are radio frequency issues when it comes to industry licensing, even in some global jurisdictions where you need to get a wireless license to have wireless cameras if you're using it in an industrial setting. Wired cameras are certainly more prevalent and normally wired through a network. But again, that is a decision, and there are some reasons why you would not use a wired camera. We want to look at the practicality of the location. You may have a great place to put a camera to see what you want to see, but it could be impractical, and I'll show you an example of that and tell you about an example of that. And then we want to talk about mounting hardware, which really is a pretty significant decision, especially when you talk about something called cost of ownership. So when we talk about task and purpose in application, it really is, as I said, the number one most important piece of this puzzle. And when you ask the task, what does the camera need to see? You want to think about your field of view. So as we talked about last week, when you look out and you put a camera on the side of a building, you say, wow, that's a pretty picture because 90% of it is just pure blue sky. Well, I'm willing to stipulate that the sky is blue, and I don't need to see that the sky is blue unless I'm using that camera for weather purposes. So bring it down some. See more stuff happening on the ground and less sky blue, less other buildings that just don't apply to you that you don't need to see. You want to think about your field of view. The distance. You really can't enhance cameras the way that TV tells you can, even with digital and new techniques. And there are new techniques for cameras coming out all the time, and they're getting better and better all the time. But it hasn't caught up to TV of 10 years ago yet, where they take a picture of a car from a quarter mile away, and then they zoom in and give an exact, crystal clear picture of the license plate. So think about the distance. If you need to see something, how far away can you be and still see what you need to see? Think about barriers to the view, and think about barriers to the view in terms of different times of day. So if you have a camera on a side of a building and it's in front of a driveway, and at rush hour at your business there's constant traffic and it's blocking the thing you really want to see on the other side of it, then that's a barrier to the view. You may want to move that camera to a different place, right? You can still see things from different angles, but think about what's going to be in front of that camera at any particular time of day. I will tell you that when people put cameras on loading docks outside, they never think about the fact that trucks sometimes are very tall. And so a truck backs up to the dock and you can't see anything from that camera because the truck is in the way. And then the truck pulls up, at 1 a.m. and the dock is not open. So truck drivers will oftentimes pull and back up to a dock and sit and wait so they keep their place in line. Now your camera is blocked for the next, 12 hours. And lighting is the same way. Make sure that before you install a camera, you can determine whether it's sunrise or sunset that you're not going to have, or what time of day you're going to have direct sunlight into that camera lens where you're going to wash everything out. It could be a matter of hours where you see very little. So you want to worry about following the sun a little bit. Now, when it comes to the purpose, you want to talk about the level of clarity you need. Some cameras just need a classification level. If I'm watching from a distance a fence line, let's say I have a camera system in, let's say a chemical plant, right? I'm watching the fence line, make sure, nothing moves. I just need to be able to tell between a person and a deer, right? Classification. I don't need to know who that person is. If there is a person on my fence line at my chemical plant, or let's even take it one step further, let's talk about a prison, right? I have a camera system on a prison. And it's at the far fence line, right? The last line of defense between the outside free world and the prisoners. I need to know if there's a person there. Now, there could be rabbits and deer and other things that move, right? Prisons sometimes are built and oftentimes built in rural locations for obvious purposes. And I need to be able to classify whether this is a person or a deer. Now, there are other places, like in a jewelry store perhaps, where you're trying to protect the inventory and you need to see exactly who handles things. You need identification level. Now it's just not that I need to know whether this is a person or a deer. I need to know this is a person, and I need to know that person is Brian. So think about your camera placement and your camera type in terms of whether you need classification level or identification level of clarity on that image. So if you follow those things, you'll probably pick the right camera and the right location for your task and purpose. If you think about the field of view, the distance, the barriers that you may have at different times of day, the lighting and following the sun, and also following when the street lights come on, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. And then think about the level of clarity that you need. Is it classification level or identification level? So then you have to consider your environment, right? Are you going to put the camera inside or outside? As we all know, you can't put an inside camera outside of a building. It will not last. It's not built for the weather. It is not sealed enough, and you will have problems. Think about the height required, right? You can't put a camera up so high that all you're going to see are the tops of heads, right? And I have seen many instances of that where cameras are up so high that, you really want identification level or even classification. I guess you could classify that is indeed somebody wearing a hat, but that is all you're going to get. Lighting. Think about lighting angles, and do you need infrared? Infrared on a camera is usually, when you look at the lens of the camera, you'll see a ring around it that looks like it's got little LED light bulbs in it. It's an infrared light that doesn't really light up anything other than the image itself. But are you going to need infrared? Infrared will give you some washout of colors, as we talked about before. And if you don't need it, if you've got good lighting otherwise, then I'd skip the infrared sensor. But you need to understand your environment and the lighting there. Domed or open lens. So domed cameras, especially outside, are usually preferred, right, because they protect from the elements. But domed cameras, especially in cold environments, need a heater. And in very wet environments, they sometimes need to have a dehumidifier installed. And we saw some of those in last week's lecture, a dehumidifier, the small one inside of a camera. An open lens camera really doesn't have that problem. The box-shaped ones, those Pelco cameras I showed you, and some of you took some pictures of those up high on the sheets in Slippery Rock or other places maybe, but they were like the boxy ones, right? They sit outside and they kind of look like a little cannon. If you ask me, they're kind of squarish though. I'll consider that an open lens. Yes, it has glass over the front, but it's not domed. But they get a lot less condensation on those, and they have the little overhang built on the lens itself that protects it some from the rain. It's got a little awning, if you will, over the top of that glass shield. So you have to consider the environment there. And then you have to think about the climate where you're putting it, right? Is the area subject to different types of weather that you have to specifically think about? And, our friend Ben Franklin gives us the best example of that. Because I will tell you that a security camera is like a key and a kite. If it can be hit by lightning, it will be hit by lightning. I don't know what it is about them. Maybe it's the metal housings. I am not an expert in climatology nor electricity, but I will tell you that lots of cameras get replaced because of lightning strikes and because of poor placement. Now, if I had a really good camera and I wanted classification level around this facility, it's a little hard to see because it's dark. Obviously, it's during a storm. And this is a image from a camera from a distance away, right? But can you imagine what happens to the camera when that happens? When a direct lightning strike hits that little piece of low voltage camera equipment is going to start to smoke and then be done. Now, there's other things with the environment besides lightning you have to concern yourself with. Obviously, there are two things that I really want to bring up. First one is you'll see something called an explosion-proof camera. It is not explosion-proof. It is not meant to withstand an explosion. What they mean when they say explosion-proof cameras is that the camera itself is sealed so that any electricity passing through that camera will not cause an explosion. So it's an intrinsically safe camera. Those of you who may have been in the military or worked in police departments know that you have something called a green dot, right? If you have a radio, a two-way radio, it has a green dot on it. That's normally an indication that it's intrinsically safe. You can go ahead and transmit on that radio and turn it on and off in an area where you don't want to have electrical impulses that might, go in the air and cause an explosion, where you've got gases or gunpowder or whatever might explode, right? Again, not an expert on gunpowder, but where you wouldn't want to have a spark, you can use an intrinsically safe device. An explosion-proof camera is just that. It's intrinsically safe. It is not meant to withstand an explosion. Now, it does have this really hardened case on it, but that's really to limit the amount of signals and things going out that could cause the explosion, not to protect it from an explosion. You'll find that thing in pieces if you have an explosion. Second thing is that I had a very unique place. It was a research farm, and it was a very, very large operating farm, and it had silos on it. And many of you are, probably have either grown up on or been around farms, and you know that silos are big, tall, round buildings, right? You see them on every farm. And I said, okay, I'm going to put wireless cameras on top of the silos, and I'll be able to see anything coming at me, because the silos were spaced out around the farm rather than one location, because it's a very big operating farm with horses and cattle and pigs. So we put wireless cameras on top of the cameras, or on top of the silos. On day 3, I noticed that we couldn't see anything out of those cameras. It looked like it was foggy all the time. Now I'm watching them from a distance saying, wow, it's really foggy at the farm. Wow, it's really foggy at the farm. And then started looking at the weather and there was no fog. The heat from the silage was rising up and getting into the workings of the camera. It wasn't sealed well enough. And when you have silage, right, meaning corn and other things that you put into the silos, right, to use to feed the animals, they create heat. They're constantly breaking down. They're fermenting in a way, and it's creating heat. And the heat was creating steam, and the steam was getting up into the camera. Now, I sat on that for about a week and a half saying, oh, crap, I just spent a bunch of money putting those up there. Thought I was slicker than anybody else, and I was going to save a ton of money on wiring. And what am I going to do now? Because they're all fogging out and we can't see anything. I'm going to have to tell somebody. But I didn't have to worry about that because a summer storm came and hit every one of them with lightning and toasted, I think there were 7 of them at the time, toasted all 7 cameras. So then all I had to do was say, okay, we can't put those up there anymore. They're too susceptible to lightning. And I dodged a bullet. But learn from my stupidity. Think about where you're going to put the camera, what environmental things could happen to it, and really go the long distance and think it all the way through. Is this going to get caught in a windstorm? Is this and even damage, practical damage? Is this going to get hit by, a tall truck that goes by? Is it going to get get banged by a forklift when we put things up on the high racks? All of those types of things. Think about the environment so that you don't make stupid mistakes like I did. So we go from lightning to lighting and power sources. When you put up a camera, especially outside, you want to mount your camera below the lighting source that's lighting the area that you are videoing. If you go above it, okay, if you go above the lighting source, you normally get washout. You'll notice that your image is not nearly as crisp and you're going to have big kind of blotchy white areas below you, okay? So you want to mount exterior cameras below the lighting source. It also cuts down on halos. If you're looking down at a lighting source and looking down at other lighting sources, you're going to get halos. That same effect you get when you're driving in the sunshine on your windshield. It's kind of hard to see, right? You're going to try to avoid that by mounting cameras below the lighting source. Your camera should always be hardwired whenever possible. They make kits that you can essentially just plug in the camera into a standard outlet. And I have seen cameras where someone has purposely installed an outlet close to the ceiling, mounted a camera on the ceiling, and run the cord down and plugged it into the wall. Or put a plug right behind where you mounted the camera on the wall. And, bad guys are pretty stupid, but they're usually smart enough to unplug the camera before they take it with them. You should hardwire your cameras in so that wiring's not exposed. And if any wiring or cabling is exposed, you use something called a wire mold or a conduit, and you cover it so that nobody can cut the wiring. But never plug in your cameras unless you absolutely have to. It's just a bad practice, and I have seen so many installers do it. And in fact, even hire an electrician to put a plug on the wall right behind where you're going to put the camera so you can plug it in. And it's at ceiling, normal 8-foot ceiling height. Anybody with a step stool or a stick can unplug that thing. Now, many of the modern cameras, and most of them, run over power over Ethernet, which is essentially you're plugging it into an Ethernet port, which is a network port, what communicates to the internet, and the minimal amount of power that goes through there is enough to power the camera. So you're getting your data, your camera data going back to your NVR, usually in this case, and your power over that same piece of wire. Now, in many cases, in a wireless camera, perhaps you're not going to plug it into an Ethernet port, or maybe you don't have Ethernet out that far and you're going to run it over some other way, but the camera is set to work as a PoE camera, right? That's the camera you have. You're going to reposition one. Let's say you're going to take it from someplace that's on your network in your business, and you're going to move it out to a new building that doesn't have a network in it yet. You can get something called a PoE injector, power over Ethernet injector, and it essentially will turn that camera into one that you can hardwire or plug in. It's an adapter, and they do make those. So just know that oftentimes someone will say, well, you have a PoE camera here, and you're going to put cameras in your new building, and even though you don't need this one anymore, you can't reuse it because you don't have any network out in the other building. You can get PoE injectors, saves you a ton of money, and you can reuse cameras. And you should always reuse cameras when you can, right? When your facility changes, when your your mission changes and you don't need cameras in a certain area anymore, you take them down and you reuse them somewhere else when the need applies. So you can change a PoE camera, power over Ethernet camera, with an injector to one that you can hardwire. You should always hardwire and protect that wiring, and then mount those cameras below the light source to protect against washout and halos. So next you have to think about your transmission method, right? How are you going to get the signals from the camera back to wherever you're going to record it? And normally it's wired. Some of the cameras that you guys took pictures of, like the ones, I think there were some at the PNC Bank, I think it was on campus. That's probably on the campus network. I would almost guarantee it is. But the ones at Sheetz that were on the outside of the building and Dunkin' Donuts, my guess is that they don't have a robust network. They probably have a business network that's wireless, much like the internet you have in your apartment or your home. And the cameras are running over either coax cable or a twisted pair of wires. There's a little adapter you can put on. They can run over a standard twisted pair of copper wires. That's starting to become old school, but in places where you're running just your regular wireless internet network, like a Dunkin' Donuts, right? A small shop. If you are the security manager for a business that has, hundreds and hundreds of retail locations, right? If you're a security manager for McDonald's, and by the way, I knew one of those guys, and he was banking all kinds of money. The networks are normally, a Comcast or Spectrum or whoever the local provider is puts in a business network. It's faster than your home one, but it's set up the same way. The cameras in those places are normally going back via coax or twisted pair or, some other type of cabling, right? 485 cable, something that's hardwired. You can obviously use wireless, a Ring doorbell or a Blink camera, wireless. It seems easier. And it is when you're talking about home environments in very small systems. But if you have hundreds of wireless cameras, then you have hundreds of data streams coming in. You really need a very robust network. And if your business is one that, is large, let's say a hospital, right, where you've probably got 100 cameras or more in a decent-sized hospital all around, and you need your wireless for transmission of medical data and insurance data, your IT department is not going to look favorably on you if you say, I want to put 100 wireless cameras and steal all that bandwidth. Because as you know, streaming does take some bandwidth. Your cell phone is using more data when you're streaming a video than it does when you're talking on a call or you're emailing or you're reading something. So you're going to use a lot more bandwidth than the average bear if you have a lot of wireless cameras. So you have to think about that. And then also when you're talking about wireless, a lot of times you'll do what I did with those silos, right? I used wireless because I wasn't going to run a coax cable or any kind of a communication cable up the side of the silo. Very expensive, hard to maintain. I mean, it just didn't seem worth it, right? I had a guy with a lift, and he got up to the top of the thing, right? Climbed up to the top and put up the camera and hooked up the wireless, right? But that meant I needed to have wireless internet, right? I needed to have a wireless signal out that far. You don't necessarily want to run these things over your normal cell phone networks, right? You want to have a proprietary network because you don't want anybody tapping into your cameras, which means that you have to extend your wireless network out much farther than your buildings. So if you say, I want to put a wireless camera on my network, but I want to put it in the far reach of the far parking lot because I don't want to run wiring all the way out there, but I need to have a camera in that parking lot, just know that your active network now is going to be accessible to people all the way out there because you need it out there for the camera, which means that someone who tries to break into your network can sit in that lot and access the network. Doesn't mean they can get in. You have proper protections and firewalls. The cybersecurity folks will tell you they can protect it, and that's true. But it does leave it somewhat more vulnerable. So wireless cameras, have their place where you can't get wiring, but then you also have to think that you're going to expose your wireless network out a little farther. So I would say that 95% of cameras in use today in industry are wired cameras, normally through a network. When you're talking about larger industries, and normally through cabling of some kind when you're talking smaller storefronts or even big companies that have many, many retail locations. Normally wired is what you're going to find. And finally, I want you to consider the practicality of the location. I mean, there are just some things that when you think about it, when you plan your cameras, when you do it for our project or you do it, in your real first job, don't just plot the cameras and say, okay, that's it. Do it smart. Plot the cameras and take a couple days to observe and think about what that camera might see, and go and stand in the place of that camera and say, okay, what might it see at this time of day or that time of day? Will traffic impede your purpose? I have seen so many people put cameras on the outside of a building, not considering that they're trying to see. They put it on building A so they can get a view of the entry of building B across the street, and then find out once traffic picks up you can't see anything because the camera's mounted a little too low, or just from the wrong angle, where anytime trucks go by they block it and you can't see anything and you just don't see what you want to see. Is there a chance of damage or vandalism? Normally, you want to have your cameras up a little bit, so cameras are not real great when somebody hits them with an aluminum baseball bat. They're rugged, and those domes are really made ruggedized now, where you can hit them. You can buy them where you really can hit them with a bat or a crowbar, and you'd really have to smack them. They make them bulletproof, but quite frankly, it doesn't take much. Once you start hitting the housing, something's going to give. And so if you think that the camera might be vandalized, you want to put it up a little bit higher, right? Is it practical to put it down low where you really want to look at somebody's face when that person can then manipulate the camera right in front of them? How far is the wiring run and the power run? I mean, that's a practical consideration. Again, you want to put a camera in the far corner of the far parking lot, and there's power out there because there's power poles, but there's no wiring. Maybe if you put it in the close corner, focused back toward the back corner, you'd get just a different angle, but you'd see the same things essentially, and you'd have a shorter wire run. Can you accomplish that same task and purpose from an easier location? And that's really what should drive you. The task and purpose is the number one thing. And if the task is to see the sidewalk in front of the building, and the purpose is to understand if protesters are lining up in front of your building because you're a security manager for a very controversial business and you might get protests. You could put it up, high on the side of the building, pointed right down at that sidewalk. But then you have to worry about it being up high in the air, and you have to service it at some point. You've got to get a lift truck. Could you put it inside the building, looking out a window? Right? Oftentimes you have cameras that sit in a building, and they're actually looking out the window at the sidewalk, and you don't even see them as you walk by, and they're on what's called the protected side, which is where if you can ever mount a camera on the protected side, you always do that. But think about that. Will you get deterrence benefits? Now, the camera mounted inside that window won't give you deterrence benefit because people on the outside don't really see it. So it's not going to slow them down from doing things. But if you want deterrent benefit from that camera, if you want people to see that camera and to think twice, then think about where you want to mount it. And then think about aesthetics. You can mount cameras just about anywhere. But if you have a big sign with your company name and you've spent a ton of money on lighting and aesthetics and landscaping around it and flowers, and then you try to mount a camera on top of that, you are not going to be the most popular person at the dinner table. So you have to think about aesthetics. And I'm sure that you can get somebody who's a landscape designer to help you with cameras as well when you plot exterior cameras especially. But I will tell you that I'm doing a project right now in New York where there were 3 cameras on an executive floor, and the interior designer is pushing back saying, I don't want those cameras, 3 of them anyway, hanging down. I know you need them. Can you do it with some other way? And we're actually going to use fisheye camera in a better location. And with 1 camera, I'll get the view of the 3. And so the aesthetics told me to use a different camera at a different location. So you always have to think about that, because you put up a camera and it really looks bad where it is, you're not going to be popular, and it makes you look like you didn't think it through. Now, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about camera mounts, and it's something that is almost an afterthought for many people when you're putting a camera system together, but I think it's something that ought to be in the forefront for a couple of reasons. First off, the camera mount can obstruct your view. If you mount the camera the wrong way, if you mount the camera directly on the side of a building, you are, by definition, not able to see 180 degrees behind you. Now, if you were to mount that camera on something that stood off from the building out even just 3 or 4 feet, you'd at least be able to see right down the edge of the building and see a little bit behind you, perhaps. Or if you're interior and you put it in a camera in the corner, you're going to see walls on one side. If you put it in the middle, you'll be able to see the entire room. Now, there are reasons to put cameras in corners. but think about whether or not the mount and the place you mount and the mount itself might obstruct your view. You also have to think about the cost of ownership. And by cost of ownership, when you buy the camera and you've invested the capital in the camera and the installation, that money is a sunk cost, right? It's already there. You've already spent that money. But now you have to maintain that camera. Lenses need to be adjusted. Parts sometimes fail and they need to be fixed. If nothing else, domes need to be cleaned and lenses need to be cleaned. And so you have a cost of ownership associated with every camera. And the camera mount can have a great impact on your cost of ownership and driving it down, which is where you want to go. And then think about how it will look. There are camera mounts that are just plumb ugly in the wrong place. And when you put them up, there's no way you can put lipstick on a pig and make it look good. So you want to make sure that it looks nice, and that if you're using your camera for deterrent factor, if you want people to see it, then you want it on the right mount as well. You want it seen, so you're going to want to use something that will attract some attention so that bad guys will see that you have a camera system. So let's talk a little bit about mounts and just some of the common ones that are used. So here's a very simple ceiling mount camera. You see the dome on the bottom. And then in the center is, in this case, it's a drop ceiling. So drop ceiling are those ceiling tiles that you put into the grid, right? They're in just about everybody's basement from the 50s. If you redid your basement, you'll have a drop ceiling in there. They're just those really soft tiles that go up. And you put this cage on top. It's just a bracket, and it distributes the weight, and it holds the camera in place. The wiring goes up through that little tube in the middle. That's actually a tube. And you run your wires back to wherever you're going. Power gets in the same way. Drop ceilings are good and bad for cameras. They are good because they're very easy to mount, right? I mean, you can drill through those things with a screwdriver, right? You just poke a hole and run your wires through and mount your bracket. And you can do it at the ground level and then put it back up in place. The bad thing is that anybody can rip it down because they are movable. But if you put a camera in a drop ceiling, tell your installer to coil up at least as much cabling and wire coming off of it so that can be moved in the room. So think about a 10 by 10 room with a drop ceiling, and you have this camera in the corner. And you use it there for a while, but then you have something going on in the center. Let's say it's a medical office and you want to be able to see something and you need it in the center now. They've rearranged the furniture in the room, you need to move it. If they have put extra wire when they ran the camera and just, they put a twist tie on it, right? Or a wire strap on it where you've got this coil of wire, you can then just move it inside the ceiling, right? And replace that tile that has the camera on it with one of the other ones of the same size and move the camera around yourself. Very easy to do, but when you install the camera, think about that. You want to have an installer put in extra wire whenever they put in a camera mount so that that camera can be moved anywhere in the room. Otherwise, they're going to have to rewire it if you want to move it. You can move it yourself if they've given you enough slack. So if you want to be up and on top of things and looking down, you can put in, you'll see a couple of them here actually. These are cameras on pendant mounts. And they're just that. It's a pendant that hangs down from the ceiling. Couple good things about pendant mounts is that, as you can tell here, you could put a fisheye in and see a really good shot of everything down below. Nothing's going on up above you, so you don't need to see it. But you're going to drop it down so that you're getting around all of the lighting fixtures and potentially heating, ventilation, air conditioning, duct work, and all that stuff. You're getting below that, and you're hanging it down, and they give you a really good view. Now, if they are too high, you will see ants moving below you. That's the problem with a parapet mount, is that, the pendant mount, which is what this is. Trouble with a pendant mount is that unless you have them really long, you're going to be pretty far away from what you're seeing. The other issue is that if they're too long, then they tend to move a little bit with vibration, and it's going to move your picture around a little bit, and they may get hit. Now, I would say in our warehouse that we are considering, you might be thinking that pendant mounts are good for the inside, and I would not disagree that, especially in that big bay area, they will give you a pretty good view. So think about the pendant mounts for inside. I would say in our warehouse, if you had 2 fisheye lens parapet mount, you could cover that entire working bay area of that warehouse based on the size that's shown there, maybe 3, but I would say that you could argue that 2 could cover it because you're pretty high up. So now I want you to do me a favor, take your hand and open up put your palm facing you, and then put your palm on your nose and tell me what you can see around it, right? Think about what you can see. Now just start drawing your hand away from your face, and you're seeing more, and you're seeing more, and you're seeing more. Now your hand is about a foot from your face, and you can see pretty much around it. And if you get out about 2 feet, you can see even more. And if you can get out 3 feet, well, you're pretty darn tall, but I think you get the picture. A gooseneck mount on a pole on the outside does just that. It gives you a standoff so that you don't hug the wall, so that your hand is not against your nose and you're trying to see around it. You just need a slight standoff, and that's what a gooseneck does. It also drops the camera down height-wise just a little bit, and it keeps the the camera from being strapped directly to the pole, right? So goosenecks have their place, but oftentimes people put these on poles outside and they put them up too high. Anything over, say, 17 feet, in fact, I would even say 15 feet, you're going to require more than just a ladder to get up to work on these. You can't rest a ladder against a round pole safely, so you'll need a step ladder. And think about a step ladder. I have a 10-foot one at my home. I think they probably go to 12 and maybe even 15. Maybe there's a 20 out there. But how safe do you want someone to be when they're working on these things if you go up too high? So a lift is required to safely get up to these things. Most companies don't have a lift. They have to go rent one. They're rather expensive, and there went your cost of ownership. So if you're going to use a gooseneck, measure from the bottom of the camera itself to the ground. Try to keep it 15 feet or less. But if you're tight to the pole, you're going to see that effect of that hand against your nose, right? So the gooseneck has a purpose of opening up the view behind the camera. The pole is still going to be in the way, but not nearly as much as it is if you had it strapped directly to the pole. So now you get up on top of your buildings, and you're going to try to look out onto your parking areas and your grounds and those things. And as you can see here, there's a 360 camera, and it's on something called a parapet mount. And the parapet mount is very cool for one reason, in my opinion. Well, two reasons, actually. It stands off from the building, so you get that same effect you get with a gooseneck, even better because it stands out even farther. And these parapets usually go out about 4 or 5 feet, sometimes a little more. You can extend them. They can go out, but then they start to look kind of ugly if they get out too far. But when you want to repair the camera, you just swing this around. Down in the base, and it's hard to see, you can't see it in this picture, but where my arrow is right now, you can put this on a swivel. And when you want to work on this camera, you take the pin out down here, and you just turn this whole thing around, and you stand on the roof comfortably, and you work on the camera. Then when it's done, and you know it's working, you put it back, you swing it back out there, put the pin back in, and it sits out there where it needs to be. Extremely good for cost of ownership, because can you imagine if you had to get a lift on a 5, 6, 7, 8-story building to get up there to work on that camera? The swing-away parapet mount is probably one of your best friends when it comes to cost of ownership on a camera system on the exterior, and they're very easy to install. They're very safe. You do have to worry a little bit about the lightning strikes if that's what your weather is, right? So you've always got to consider that. But if you are mounting cameras on the outside of a building up high, you should always consider whether you can mount them on the roof off a parapet mount so that you can work on them very cheaply. There's a couple other ways, though, that you can get this accomplished even without that swing away. So let's start on the right-hand side and work our way back because the last one, the panoramic, is just one that I don't quite understand myself, and I haven't seen too many of them in use, but it is marketed for the same purpose. This is a hinged pole. This locks in here. You put the camera up on the top, and when you want to work on the camera, you unhook it, and these are usually about 20 feet to maybe 25 feet up. You don't want to have them any more than that because then it's kind of hard to get out even 12 feet. But basically you unlatch the bottom here, and you just swing this out, and the camera comes down to ground level so that you can work on it. If it's a 25-footer, you're going to be about 12 feet here in the center, right? Unless you can actually hinge them down a little farther, but for safety purposes, halfway is best. You're going to be up about 12 feet still, so you're still going to be on a ladder working on it, but certainly you don't need a lift truck to get it all the way to the top of the 25, right? So the hinged pole is actually rather expensive. I think to have these shipped in. Last semester I had students that wanted to use this in the parking lots of the facility we were doing, and I actually went and priced them out, and they were about $3,000 a piece. And then you had to sink them into concrete and have them installed. With the installation, I talked to somebody who puts them in, and they said they were $10,000 a piece to put them in. Now, you will save tremendous amounts of money on camera maintenance because they just get dropped down, right? But here in this picture, you can see that the camera's here, and it's actually on a cable. And these can actually be run by remote control, or you have a crank down here, and you have a key, and you unlock the key, and then the crank will turn, and the camera's up top, and it lowers itself down on a long cable. It's on a spool. You work on the camera, and then you crank it right back up into place, and it snaps back up. It's got set little gears, if you will, little notches that get it in the right place, so it snaps right back in the right place. Then you turn the key, and you lock it in place, and your camera's ready to go. The wiring is on the cable. The cable drops it down. Everything is in place that you need to work on the camera on the ground. These are really great when you have very, very tall poles. So you're talking like parking lots in sporting events, right, where you go out in the parking lot. If you look up, those lighting poles are really up high because they want that light to spill over for a very large area because, sports venues like, if you go see the Penguins play or the Steelers play, I don't know why you do that when you can watch the Lions at home, but nonetheless, you're going to notice that the light poles are very much taller in those big parking lots because they're trying to wash over a high area. Their cameras, if they're on the poles, will likely be on these types of cables. Now this panoramic one here, actually, this can be adjusted so it swings down. This arc can swing down, but I've never seen it really. I've seen these probably in use 2 or 3 times in my entire career. I think they're a bit of a gimmick. I don't think you save too much from the size of this arc. But you will see these, and they actually, aesthetically, they're kind of cool. They look very modern, and I thought I'd throw one in here. But the wind-down ones can be a little finicky, right? They can get stuck. It's a cable, right? And cables can get stuck, especially if they're not used all the time. They're not, lubricated properly. The hinged pole isn't. It's very simple. It's just that. It's a hinge. But you can use these on much taller applications than you can on these. But they will save your cost of ownership because, again, one of the biggest things with the cost of ownership, especially with external cameras, is the height you have to work on them. You have to get a certified lift truck, a safe way to get to that camera if it's up over 20 feet for sure. And that's going to cost you quite a bit of money. Certainly in the life of the camera, you'll spend more on maintenance than you would on the camera itself if you have to get a lift truck every time to work on them. So once you've got your camera up there, now you've got some recorder choices to make. You can use a network video recorder, right? You can put it on premise or you can put it remote, just like our host for our access control. But remote sucks up a lot of bandwidth. So you will often find that companies will put their host for their access control remotely because that doesn't use much bandwidth, right? You can do it from anywhere. But the video recorders will be on premise, and they will actually have a call up so that if you are monitoring the alarms at your facility from another building 50 miles away, very easy to do. Something happens, you go to the network video recorder and call up that camera that's associated with that alarm that went off so you can look around the building and see what's going on. But you don't have them running constantly. If you had them remotely, they'd have to run constantly between the two places 50 miles apart, and you're going to use up bandwidth. So the network video recorder is often on-premise, and you go and you call it up from there to look at it, just like you do when you go into your video on demand from your house, right? The Roku device or the Fire Stick that you're using, whatever you're using to stream video, it's not stored on your TV. It's stored someplace at their headquarters, and they're streaming it to you. But they're not streaming all the shows at one time. They're doing it as you call them up. Same principle. The hardware needs to be maintained on these things. They are a server. They need to be in a safe location, safe dry location. They need to have backup power. And the life cycle is about 3 to 5 years on them. And that's mainly because of changes in technology more so than anything else. But I find that if you have a NetVR for 5 years, somebody's going to be selling you a new one because it's going to be impossible to get software to run on those old devices because it changes so frequently. They also have limited memory. You can buy more hardware and more memory. But if you are running video on them, it depends on whether you're doing it video only on motion, where you're only recording when something moves in front of the camera, or if you're recording everything, whether it's just nighttime and nothing's moving at all, but you're still recording. A lot of factors affect the memory that you're going to get out of these things, but it is limited. And so I have cameras in the field I normally will hook 16 cameras to a NetVR. I will run them on video motion. I have them set for 30 days, and then after 30 days, they just start to overwrite themselves. I find that if I go any more than that in an industrial setting, I probably could go 45 some places or even 60. But if not, I have to upgrade the memory. Now, you can definitely record on board on these things, like the Blink camera, right? It records and it stores the video on board so you can go back and look at it. You can push those to a cloud. You buy space. Instead of buying hardware on your site, you buy space from a cloud provider and you pay monthly. And places like Microsoft Azure or Amazon Web Services will gladly, through a vendor, sell you space to store your video. And updates and patches can be pushed to the camera from that cloud. So if you go with a camera supplier that says, we'll record your video for you in the cloud, and you can call it up from the cloud anytime from anywhere, that's a great deal. And indeed, they will also push any security patches to the cameras themselves so that nobody can, use the camera as a way to hack into your network. However, when you do that, you have automatically increased the chance of hacking into your network because you're putting it out there in somebody else's cloud. You've lost the control, and that's something you have to think about. Now, this week in the reading, there was a article on Verkada. They'll call it Verkada, I think, in the news report. But if you talk to the people there, they refer to their company as Verkada. They will store on board on the camera. You can store 6 months or more worth of video on their cameras. It's like a little laptop, essentially, with a camera on it. It's a pretty good quality camera as well. And that's really convenient because you have no NetVRs to worry about if you can store that much, right? Because you're not going to store video forever normally. Only as long as it's useful, and then you just overwrite it. But when those cameras got hacked, and they did, and many, many of them did, 300,000 to be exact, in one swift move, then all of that video was accessible, and there wasn't anything they could really do about it because they were getting it directly from the camera, really. And so you have to think about whether you want to store video on the camera itself. And if you do store it on the camera itself, if the camera itself gets stolen, then all the imagery got stolen with it. Or whether you want to send it to a recorder that holds the video, but then you buy hardware. All your choice. In our little project, I think you'll have the budget money to get net video recorders and keep them on premise if you feel safer doing that. You won't have to spend that money, but you will have a item in the budget when we get to the budget that you'll have to take for the cloud storage cost. It's going to be about a wash. So if I were you, I think I would just, in our case, probably use a NetVR. But again, just as I said 100 times in this project, you make your decisions on the project because it's your project. And I really want to see you be creative and tell me why you did something that I did in a different way, because I'm not going to argue with you if you have great logic. And finally, when it comes to video systems, I really want to talk about device security. Cameras come with a password, right? They're a device. They're an internet device if you're plugging them into the network, right? Just like your we talked about Roku, right? When you plug the Roku into your network at home and you fire it onto your internet, it is now a network device, and someone could get to your network using that device if you don't put your password in. That is why they prompt you and make you put in passwords of certain lengths, which is a pain in the butt, but they do that to protect you from yourself. I will tell you that camera installers are notorious for hooking up cameras, putting them online, and keeping the default passwords because when they come back to work on them, they already know what the password is. And you can go online to any camera manufacturer just about and look up their specification sheets on a particular model of camera, and in there it will tell you what the default factory password and username is for that camera. And you will find that you can likely go somewhere, and if you were to be able to get to the camera system, you could get to that camera because they don't change it, because they want it to be the same, because they have to go to multiple facilities, these repair guys. They might go to 10 different places in a day to work on cameras that have problems at different businesses. They don't want to have to go search for the password, so they make them all the same. And if the default one comes out of the box that way, all the easier. Remember that wireless cameras can sit at the edge of your site, right? Because you're using wireless for a reason. You're using it because it's hard to run wire to that place. but that makes it a pathway to your data. You have to run your wireless network, your internet signal, right? Your available network is now available in the parking lot, and normally you want to just keep that in your building. Most cameras today operate on NetVRs, and as such, they don't get those security patches at the camera level that they probably should. And if there was an incident where someone did hack into your network going through a camera, because it's on the network, you're the one who's going to hang on it, right? So device security is something you need to be arranging. And you do that by putting it in a contract with your camera provider and your camera repair, your integrator, as they're called. You put it in a contract that they are responsible for making sure that cameras have software patches, firmware updates, and password changes every X months, right? Whatever you want, whatever you're comfortable with, whatever your corporate policy may be even. But you can put that into a contract that they have not only maintenance on the camera itself, but they're responsible for the cyber hygiene of that device. And that is a great way for you to protect yourself. So just remember that when you're doing contracts for cameras someday, when you're out there in the real world, ask them about their cyber program and how they're going to protect your cameras that way as well. Okay, here we are, and I didn't tell you at all about where to put cameras inside that warehouse because I want to see what you think. You've looked over the cameras themselves last week. You went to Access's website or some of the others. You saw some of the demos, and I think you understand how the cameras work. I think you understand now how the mounts work and how the lighting affects it and how the environment might affect it, although we're just doing inside this week or coming up in the next 2 weeks. You won't be plotting your cameras this week unless you want to. I would suggest you take a quick look at it and think about where you might want to put cameras because that is coming up as an assignment. You can get a little ahead if you want to. But task and purpose are going to be the driver. For any camera that you put in when we have our meetings in week 14, I will be asking you what the task and purpose of cameras are. You're going to pick the camera based on the practical criteria given, right? Just because it's a pan tilt zoom doesn't mean it's better than fixed. Just because it's same thing with your mounts, right? Just because it's up on the ceiling, do you need to have a parapet mount, or could you use something different? Or a pendant mount. I apologize for confusing those two. Just because you want to be up on the roof, do you need to have a parapet mount, or would you just have maybe a gooseneck going off the side so you could reach the camera? You'd have to stretch a little bit. That might be something, but there's different things you can use. But think about the purpose and the most practical criteria. Think about your power and your transmission source. Is it wired? Is it wireless? Are you using power over Ethernet, or are you going to run power to it? And are you going to plug it in, or are you going to hardwire it? Which the answer should always be hardwire if you can do that. You have two choices on the recorders. The tested and trusty, as I call it, with the NVR, or the slick and cheaper with the cloud. But in the long run, I don't know that it's going to be cheaper. But it is the way of the future, so think about that. And then also think about device security being your responsibility. Have a plan for that in your contracts with your camera provider. That's it for this week. So this week ahead, you have reading. There's none. And the lecture is now done. There's a quiz due on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. The quiz will come likely from a test bank of questions, not just 10 separate questions. So have your notes ready. I'm looking for volunteers to be team leaders. In week 13, your teams will get together. I'll discuss this more in the next couple of weeks, but they'll get together for a short session on everybody submitting their final drawings, what they think is right, and you guys meeting together to decide what you want to adopt from each one of those drawings and come back with a single drawing. So you'll have, say, 5 members of your team. You'll get together and you guys will discuss, what lock did you put on this door? Where did you put readers? You're going to have differences. And then you guys hash out as professionals, and this is just the way it's done when you design a new building for security. So you're going to do it exactly the same way. You will hash out what the best plan is collectively, and your team leader will plot that out on a drawing. And in week 14, you will meet with me and the rest of the team, and we will go over that drawing, and I will ask you questions about why you made certain choices, how you're going to do your installations, what factors brought you to the decision as to what was best and what was not best. So I'm looking for team leaders. There will be some compensation, if you will. There'll be a decreased workload during the final week. And I know you all have finals to do, so if you can reduce your workload during finals, that's a good thing. So if you do volunteer to be a team leader, you have to do a little heavier lifting in weeks 13 and 14, but not in week 15. You must be carrying an A grade. That's based on your current grade. I've been looking over the drawings as they've been coming in. Now think about what you did with the drawings, by the way. You layered your drawings. You did locks, and then you did electronics and readers, then you did alarms. I'm going to go back in to the last set of drawings because you made some changes along the way. Many of you did, actually, from the third set of drawings from the first set, which just had locks on it, right? You learned and you changed. If I go into the third one and everything looks good, I'm just going to take that grade and revert it back to the other two. So if you get a 5 on the third one, then you're going to get a 5 on the other two. The reason for that is that you are actually integrating your system as you go along. You just didn't realize it. But when you layer these and you do things one at a time from the simplest devices to the more complex, you are identifying where you're putting things and you're making sure that everything works together with everything else. Nobody put a reader on a door with a passage set because you knew that a passage set was going on someplace that wasn't going to require a reader. It was someplace that didn't have any real resource to protect on it. But had you done it the other way around, you may have had to go back. So we're doing it in this order for a reason. I'm grading it in this way for a reason. If you have not heard from me, you can rest assured that you've done pretty well in your drawings, at least well enough that we'll be able to have discussions in week 13 and 14. And I think that even though your drawings may not be the way I would do them, perhaps, that's okay. And even if there are some flaws in there, I think you'll understand what those flaws are. So don't anybody sweat those drawings. I have looked over every single one of those drawings that you've submitted. And if you were in trouble, I would let you know. So look at your current grade as it stands. And if you have an A, and if you are interested in being a team leader, please let me know this week by email. I've already reached out to some of you to gauge your interest, just in the trying to make things a little more efficient. But if you do have interest, please let me know. With that, have a great week. I will be around all week. If you have questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. Don't be afraid to reach out to me because that's what I'm here for. Have a great week.